Hello everyone, I hope you're all well. Hope you all had a nice Easter break, didn't do too much sunbathing. So what we're going to look at today is the other main function of Parliament, which is scrutiny of the executive. Before we do that though, I just want to make sure we're all happy with what you did before Easter, which was the role of backbench MPs and how effective are backbench MPs regarding the government. So remember last time we spoke, you had to do that work about what the backbench MPs do. Um, Clearly, there are a number of roles which they do. One of them is to scrutinise legislation, i.e., check over legislation. And you should know from previous lessons that when they go to those committees to scrutinise legislation, they're quite weak. If the government's got quite a large majority, they can basically disregard backbench MPs because the whips and people like that keep them in their place. However, when the government's got a very small majority, like for example the Theresa May government did last year and the year before that, then backbench MPs can have much more influence. So if a Prime Minister and the whips can keep their MPs in line, they've always got a majority in the House of Commons, therefore they don't need to worry too much about them. But if they've got a small majority, only needs a few MPs to say, you know what, I'm not going to vote for this, I'm going to even vote for the other side, then that can cause all sorts of problems. And the best examples of that are those really big defeats which Theresa May faced. She had a very small majority anyway. With the DUP support, she had a majority of one. Again, it doesn't take many, does it, for to lose overall control of Parliament, which is what we saw under Theresa May. So I would say if you get a question about backbench MPs and their relationship with the government, governments being able to control Parliament, that type of stuff, well, you can say that governments with small majorities, Theresa May is a really good example, John Major is the other one, in the 1990s, they suffer more defeat because they got a small majority. And also, a lot of their MPs were quite unhappy, weren't they, as well, with the Major government and the Theresa May government over Brexit. And so they were willing to rebel and defeat the government on certain issues. So there's some points you could mention. However, governments with big majorities, like the Blair government perhaps, and I would probably say the current Johnson government, and to some extent the coalition, because the two parties together had a majority of about 80, they suffer fewer defeats because it requires a lot of backbench MPs to show their unhappiness. So you need to make sure in essays about Parliament you try and get kind of, it's not a static institution, it changes depending on the size and majority of the government and things like that. And so very often May and Major you can probably put together and say they both had a more difficult to control in Parliament due to backbench MPs, etc., etc. And you could probably have like Blair, for example, and Thatcher, if you want to say, they had a much easier time, they had very few defeats because they had such big majorities. So they were the two I kind of always kind of put together as a little pairing for that type of question. Regarding backbench MPs and legislation, so as we've already said, backbench MPs basically they're controlled by the whip to keep them in line. If the government's got a decent majority, then the government doesn't really need to worry too much about MPs rebelling and stuff like that. The other way which MPs can have an influence on legislation is if they introduce their own, which is called private members' bills. Now, the video you watched before Easter, it talked about that, it showed you that taking place. I'm not going to go through all of that. But again, you can see the problems they have. There's very little legislation which gets passed through a private members' bill. If the government, I mean, for a start, there's only like 20 a year anyway, out of what, 650 MPs, the chance of being selected is quite slim. If the government don't like the legislation which you want to introduce as a backbench MP, then they'll basically destroy it. They've got a majority in the House of Commons, and they can destroy it at first reading, second reading, or at the committee stage. And you saw from that video, didn't you, that MP for Cornwall North, I think it was, or Cornwall South, he tried to get that change made, which the government didn't like. And of course, you saw there how I think it was Jacob Rees-Mogg, wasn't it, and friends basically killed it in the committee stage. So very little legislation gets through with private members' bills. The only ones that ever do get through are those, if you like, which the government likes, or they don't really have a strong opinion on. And there's been a few famous ones. So the abortion laws in the UK, which legalised abortion, that was done through a private members' bill. It was the Steele bill of the late 1960s. I want to say 1968, but don't quote me on that. Again, the government looked favourably upon that, but they didn't want to kind of get involved in such a moral issue themselves, so they kind of let it through. And they had like a free vote, which means that MPs could vote how they liked on their conscience, and they voted for the Abortion Act. So there are a few bits of private members' bills who do go through, but not many. And again, the percentage is quite low. So again, in terms of effectiveness, you could say, well, it's not very effective because most private members' bills fail. So I hope we're okay on that. And if you get a question in the exam about, is Parliament good or bad or whatever, you can get a nice paragraph about legislation and its role in scrutinising legislation. You could do one about the effectiveness as well of backbench MPs if you wanted. What we're going to focus on today is the relationship between Parliament and the executive, i.e. the government, because one of the main functions of Parliament is to scrutinise the executive. In other words, to make sure the government's doing the right things, asking awkward questions if you like. Why have you made that decision? Why have you made this decision? Did you realise there's these problems and those problems? Now, we've already had a little look at this because when we did about the departmental select committees a couple of weeks ago, they were to do with scrutinising the executive, weren't they? So if you remember those committees which are permanent for the period of time of the Parliament, MPs can build up some expertise. They ask particular questions. They can ask ministers to come, civil servants to come, and ask them questions about their department. Minister, what do you think's been happening in this, and what do you think's been happening in that? They have gone on digitally, some of these, given the current coronavirus situation. So they've been trying to do them from home. So like Yvette Cooper chairs the Home Affairs Select Committee. She's a Labour MP. Can't remember his first name. His surname is Halfon. He chairs the Departmental Select Committee for Education. So again, these people have kind of almost like a second career, if you like, about being chairs of these committees, and they can ask awkward questions of ministers and civil servants, and they can keep an eye on them. On the other hand, though, there's literally like 20 MPs on these committees and a small number of staff to help them. They're up against big government departments with tens of thousands of civil servants. So again, you might want to say, perhaps the balance of power is too much in the favour of the government regarding this. Anyway, so that's one form of scrutiny, and it has some effectiveness, arguably, and we did this a few weeks ago. The other main form of scrutiny I want to look at today is questions being asked in Parliament itself. Now, there's the most famous way this is done is Prime Minister's questions. So every week, the Prime Minister has to go to the House of Commons for half an hour and answer questions from backbench MPs. Now, as you know, or as you may be aware, it ends up being a bit of a shouting match with lots of ears and all the rest of it, and jeering and stuff takes place. And you might say, is it more heat than light? In other words, is it more about the theatre of the thing? How many really detailed questions get asked the Prime Minister, which really puts him on the spot? What I'd like to do, on that series Inside the Commons, episode 1, 24 minutes in to 25 minutes in, it's literally a minute or two of it, there's a bit about why do backbench MPs want to ask questions at PMQs, what procedure do they have to go through to ask a question. It's not just done randomly, well, not entirely anyway. So do that bit. Then fast forward to 39 minutes. You need to watch the next 10 minutes. So this is when David Cameron was the Prime Minister. So it tells you what's the view of Cameron and Miliband towards PMQs. Miliband was the Labour leader at the time. And that might, because what Cameron says is quite interesting, because that might tell us the fact he had to prepare so much for it and stuff, that might suggest it's quite significant because he doesn't want to make himself look an idiot, essentially. What words would you use to describe PMQs? What's the view of the 3 MPs interviewed about PMQs? Something called bobbing as well, which you need to know. Find out what that is. It tells you on the video. So you've got various questions on here. Then there's a couple of think questions, which is where things go a bit wrong for you, isn't it? So what evidence is there from the video to suggest that PMQs is effective? Does it scrutinise the executive? Does it put, in this case, David Cameron on the spot, or Theresa May on the spot for when she had to do these things? So have a think about that. Think, well, actually, in what ways does it scrutinise the executive? And in what evidence is there say that it's not very effective? You'll see on the video the whips get involved, and what they try to do is make sure their MPs from their party ask a certain types of question, and the opposition whips try to make sure their MPs ask embarrassing type of questions. So have a watch and have a reflection that and do those questions. There's then a table I'd like to do. Is PMQs effective at holding the government to account? And is PMQs not effective at holding the government to account? So again, it's having to think about in what ways does it hold them to account and in what ways doesn't it? So if you could do that table, that would be great. One other area which I've kind of neglected to mention really, to do with backbench MPs and scrutiny, is that under John Bercow in particular, he was very keen on something called urgent questions. Now, previously, urgent questions weren't used very often, and what they essentially was that an MP, a backbench MP, might ask the Speaker, might write to the Speaker or send him an email these days or whatever to say, I'd like to ask a minister a question on this particular issue. And what happens if the Speaker says, yes, that's a good idea, he then contacts that government department, the minister, to say, I'm allowing a private question to be asked tomorrow morning at 10:30 on this question. I'd like you please to attend. And the minister has to come and answer the question which that backbench MP has asked. It wasn't used very often, but under John Bercow, he did a lot of these things. He argued it was a way for backbench MPs to scrutinise the executive on issues that come up fairly spontaneously, so to speak. There's a scandal tomorrow. Sorry, there's a scandal today. I want to ask a question to the minister. So on the graph you can see on the screen, I've tried to do this split screen thing, not sure how effective it is, but anyway, on this graph you can see there's been a big increase under John Bercow. It's not quite as good as it makes out, because yes, it allows backbench MPs to ask a question to the minister, but what they've tended to do, the government, increasingly, is put quite junior ministers in that role. So say you want to ask a question to the Treasury, you might want the Chancellor to pop up to answer your question, but what happens in reality is the Chancellor says, oh, I'm a bit too busy for that. I'm going to ask, the junior minister who makes my tea and biscuits in the morning to answer that question. So the government have kind of had a way around this, but John Bercow was quite keen on these. And there's an example on the PowerPoint screen you can see of an MP asking a question about something. I seem to think as well, on the day we all broke up in that rather hurried way before the COVID-19, when I was driving home, to talk about some urgent question as well that had been asked in Parliament. So you might want to quickly whiz onto the internet and just have a quick look at urgent questions asked this year of the government to see what comes up. Right, in terms of homework, what I want you to do is there's an article on Teams and there's some questions in your booklet called The House of Commons, a Pit of Parties and Jeering. And it's basically going over, is Parliament more about yelling and shouting, or does it actually do a proper job of scrutiny? So what I'd like to do for later in the week is to have a go at doing these questions on LPMQs, a pit of parties and jeering, or does it actually perform an important role? Okay then, so I will speak towards the end of the week. I might try and do a Zoom thing as well, so you might get some information about that. Okay then, keep safe and keep working.